Hi, my Capstone project focuses on food insecurity and climate change in Tanzania, and I'm going to propose a coalition for agroecology and food sovereignty as a solution. I came into this program to explore the nexus between ecological and population health. As a Tanzanian also, I've observed with repeated visits to the country that there's an increasing number of people who cannot access sufficient food. The assignment for Module 3 requested an analysis of a health disparity and to create an innovative solution, and that triggered a deep dive. I started with food insecurity, that took me to food production and distribution, started looking at smallholder farmers, and then I was turning in my mind agroecology and food sovereignty as the innovative solution. I have since learned that food insecurity continues to rise despite the efforts of the Tanzanian government and international aid community to eradicate it over the last 19 years. I think this was predictable. I will expound on the fundamental flaws of the industrial agricultural development, and I will demonstrate how my proposed innovation might bring about real and positive change. Sustainable Development Goal number 2 is zero hunger. End hunger, achieve food security, and promote sustainable agriculture. In 2022, almost 10% of the global population faced chronic hunger, and this number is rising. The FAO definition of food insecurity is a situation when people lack secure access to sufficient amounts of food. We measure food insecurity via quantitative indicators like rates of undernourishment, which is essentially hunger, or childhood stunting, or qualitative indicators like a surveyed scale of increasing concern in a household with their ability to access their next meal. This graphic demonstrates that food insecurity is a significant challenge in sub-Saharan Africa. And this one demonstrates that food insecurity and hunger share geospatial distribution, and in fact they have a causal link. Since the pandemic, hunger levels have increased in neighboring Kenya, and while they've remained stable in Tanzania, a quarter of the population faces chronic undernourishment. Comparing that to the world and the country in which I live, you can see that it's much higher. As a parent, this one really hits me. Food insecurity is linked to childhood stunting, which is a measure of chronic undernourishment, which has devastating consequences for physical and cognitive development that echo into the child's adolescence and adulthood. So food insecurity is a complex environmental and health issue. It spans food production, processing, distribution, and access. And it can be understood as a local symptom of a dysfunctional global agri-food system. A good quote, the underlying structure of the global system which leads to a physical and mental separation of production and consumption has devastating consequences for the global poor. Well, who are the global poor? By definition, smallholder farmers are farmers who work on less than 2 hectares of land. They actually make up 84% of the world's farms, but only 12% of the agricultural area. And yet, on that 12%, they produce a third of the world's food. Somehow, they are among the poorest and most destitute people in sub-Saharan Africa. They work in subsistence rain-fed farming on lands with decreasing soil fertility, and they are most affected by climate change, which locally manifests as later and shorter rainy seasons, which further limits production. At least on paper, then, the historical focus of government and non-governmental aid has been to support smallholder farmers in their agricultural development, to address poverty, food insecurity, and hunger at the same time. There are 2 ways to increase food production. Either we expand the existing agricultural land, which is usually to the detriment of other land uses or wild spaces, or we increase the yield on existing agricultural land. The industrialization of agriculture, called a green revolution, is founded on 2 arguments. The first is European and North American success in improving yield by industrial intensification of agriculture via chemical inputs like inorganic fertilizers, pesticides, genetically modified seeds, and that increased yield will preclude agricultural expansion and therefore protect biodiversity. Let's look at some data. Here's a Canadian example. We can see over the decades that cereal production is commensurate with cereal yield, and in fact that land use has decreased. The Tanzanian example is in contrast. Cereal production is likely attributed to increasing land use rather than yield. This data sets the foundation for the international effort. Bring the green revolution to the rest of the world. Improve yields by intensifying agriculture in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa to mimic the agricultural development of Europe and North America. But this is fundamentally flawed. Proponents of the green revolution ignore the evidence that teaches us 3 lessons. The first lesson is that industrialized agriculture is responsible for significant environmental destruction. It damages soil fertility and is the primary cause of soil erosion, both of which hasten the looming global food crisis. Industrial agriculture accounts for 70% of freshwater consumption. It decimates adjacent waterways and seas via pesticide and fertilizer contamination, and it destroys biodiversity rather than protecting it on land and in water. And finally, it contributes to 18% of greenhouse gas emissions across the globe, further driving climate change. The second lesson is that industrialized agriculture indeed does not improve hunger, undernourishment, food security, or household income in the global south. To meet the high costs of chemical inputs, industrialized farms typically focus on select crops for export rather than the local varietals to feed local populations. Historically, the Green Revolution in India did not improve hunger or food insecurity, and despite almost 15 years of industrialization efforts in East Africa, undernourishment has risen 30%. The third lesson from the evidence is that industrialized agriculture leads to social and economic devastation. It creates relationships of debt in which farmers are dependent on transnational corporations or TNCs for their chemical inputs. Genetically modified seeds supplant farmers' own seed banks and wrest control of food production from them. They also require more pesticides and inorganic fertilizers. The Green Revolution in India mired thousands of farmers in crippling debt without any demonstrable improvement in yield, hunger, or food insecurity. Moreover, land grabbing by agricultural corporations further undermines local ownership and sovereignty. Agritech companies consistently ignore, undermine, attack, and even fragment local farmers' associations, local knowledge, and local seed banks. Altogether, these factors severely undermine local resilience against future crises. In an open letter from the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute to the Gates Foundation in March of 2021, they said experiences from around the world provide further evidence that industrial monocropping will leave African communities worse off and even more dependent on aid in the future. This and a subsequent letter in August of 2024 demanding reparations for the damages incurred have gone unanswered by the Gates Foundation. Let's contrast the Gates Foundation and its Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA's goals from 2006 to 2020 against the evidence in the literature. They set out to reach 9 million farmers. They reached 2 million. They set out to double the crop yield, which is a 100% increase. The best they got was with maize at 29%, and this was at the detriment of most local crop yields, which were reduced. They set out to double household income. There's no evidence of this. In fact, feedback from Farmers Association speaks to the contrary. They set out to cut hunger by half, and as we've seen, there's been a 30% increase in undernourishment. SAGCOT, or the Southern Agricultural Corridor of Tanzania, represents another very large agricultural development initiative. And this one sets the context for the initiative, the intervention I want to propose. In 2011, this private sector initiative was proposed for the Southern Agricultural Belt of Tanzania, where 65% of the country's food production occurs. It is a top-down envisioning of agricultural development dressed as a private-public partnership to encourage investment, private investment in infrastructure, value chains, and global market linkages. It was adopted at the time enthusiastically by the Tanzanian government as part of the Kilimo Kwanza vision, which is agriculture first. And it was directly addressing local farmers as the recipients of aid to help lift themselves out of poverty. The design was a hub of a commercial monocrop farm with a processing plant surrounded by adjacent farms that were contracted as outgrowers, and they would buy the crops from the adjacent farms. In reality, the hub companies enjoyed a monopoly. They controlled prices, they used their own quality assessment criteria, and the smallholder farmers, rather than being recipients of support, served as cheap labor. This is certainly true for our example in the Kilombero district, where a sugarcane production company owns 10 kilohectares of farmland, is vying for expansion via land grabbing, and has an outgrow program with adjacent smallholder farms. A group of researchers held workshops with the farms in Kilombero, the farmers, to understand the SAGCOT experience from their vantage. The farmers articulated 6 challenges. Number 1, land ownership. Of course, they can't own land, and the best they can rent with their financial constraints is poor fertility land. And there was no guarantee to rent the next year, which really undermined sustainable planning. And they were at the constant threat of land grabbing. Certainly, soil fertility decreasing is a recognized issue in Kilombero. They were promised water, they were promised irrigation technology, and chemical inputs. These typically would arrive late and with limited access. The farmers admitted a lack of knowledge on even how to use the inputs or how to bolster soil fertility, and their largest concern was a lack of inclusivity in the decision-making process. Now that we've set the context and the background, let's look at the insights I've gleaned from the program that have helped me shape my intervention. My overarching insight is, as the Sustainable Development Goals demonstrate, global health problems are complex and interconnected, and as such, cross-sectoral coalitions are necessary to avail of myriad perspectives, resources, expertise, but also to address multiple interdependent issues at the same time to optimize success. That's SDG 17, Partnerships for the Goals. From Pillar 1, Forces of Change, I gleaned an understanding of the context via systems thinking to help identify an area of intervention, in this case, smallholder farms. From Pillar 2, Risk and Data Tools, I really appreciated the 7C models for strategic change that talked about coalitions for cohesive intervention. And I liked stakeholder identification and mapping tools as well, which I use later on today. From Pillar 3, Navigating Change, I really appreciated the power of narratives. In this case, the workshops with local farmers in Quilombeiro demonstrate powerful narratives of real-world consequences of global and national top-down policies. Pillar 4, Global Health Policy, is by far my favorite. It's an application of the previous 3 pillars to global health. In respect to social determinants of health, these are destitute farmers, further marginalized by national and global policies. Regarding commercial determinants of health, the agri-tech companies are aware of their products' destructive ramifications and continue yet to profiteer and lobby. I also appreciate the multi-level alignment that global policies are actioned at the local context, and conversely, local initiatives require higher level support and resources for sustainability. And finally, tools and resources for community engagement and sustainability. I found these particularly useful, and I'll demonstrate these later. So, the issues of food insecurity, of agricultural development, and climate change mitigation converge on the smallholder farmer's local context. So SDG 2 is therefore linked to all these other goals. So my solution is to develop a cross-sectoral coalition for agroecology and food sovereignty for the farmers in Quilombeiro, Tanzania. What is agroecology and food sovereignty? Agroecology is an umbrella term that includes permaculture, agroforestry, other soil conservation approaches. It is essentially an application of ecological processes to create diverse, resilient, and increasingly productive agricultural systems. It focuses on regenerative use of resources, no or low-till soil conservation, judicious use of biological pest controls, diversification, and reduced use of chemicals and inorganic inputs. It's also a social movement in response to the agri-food crisis, and it advocates for farmers' rights and sovereignty. There is ample evidence of the efficacy of agroecology. The University of Essex systematic review of 286 agroecological interventions in 57 countries demonstrated a 71% decrease in pesticide use across 3/4 of the subject farms. Water efficiency gains were seen across all farms. Carbon sequestration was improved, and an average of 79% increased crop yield was achieved. The conclusion is, evidence indicates that productivity can grow in many farming systems as natural, social, and human capital assets also grow. Our findings also show that poor households benefit substantially. Agroecology is also gaining ground in global policy. In 2019, a high-level panel of experts on food security examined the evidence on agroecological interventions and made the recommendation to change policy at the global and national level to move away from subsidized industrial agriculture and invest in capacity building and resources and research for agroecology. Agroecology also has precedents in sub-Saharan Africa, and in researching this, I've identified 3 potential stakeholders. The first is CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research and World Agroforestry. They have successfully integrated trees into farmland and instituted microtopographic contouring to aid with soil and water conservation, and they have transformed arid, infertile land into productive orchards and farms. The second is the Aga Khan Development Network, which is known for its multi-pronged approach. They have a Maendeleo permaculture project. They've developed an organic fertilizer and pesticide production. They're involved in agroforestry as well. They even provide microfinance and community insurance programs. And my favorite is a Green Champions program where they build capacity and expertise within community members who then go on to champion the cause to others. The third is Frigoken. It's an award-winning, socially conscious food processing company. It provides fair prices to farmers and also trains them in soil conservation and regenerative agriculture, and it employs women in processing plants, taking steps towards gender equity. Food sovereignty and agroecology share quite a bit of overlap. Food sovereignty is basically a rights-based approach. It recognizes food as a right rather than a commodity. It pushes for localization of food systems to reduce the gap between production and consumption, and it advocates for local control over food production. And finally, it always says work with nature. A potential stakeholder is the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, or AFSA. So what does the coalition look like or do? It's a bottom-up, authentically farmer-centric, nature-based approach that's necessary to counter the tremendous top-down pressure to industrialize. With smallholder farmers squarely in focus, there is evidence for nature-based agriculture to improve food security and mitigate against climate change in a scalable manner. But this will involve a paradigmatic shift in the way we conceptualize our relationship with nature. I propose a cross-sectoral coalition centered around the Quilomberos Farmers Association, including the 8 agencies I've talked about, including local government, and including existing frameworks, as we'll see. I envision that the coalition will work in 4 dimensions. The first is land ownership, as identified by the farmers themselves. Land ownership is prerequisite for long-view planning and sustainable growth. I imagine AFSA working with local and regional government to navigate the existing legal framework and discover avenues for land reclamation for smallholder farmers. Finance is number 2. It is still the largest restriction, and there are lots of ways to break this barrier, including farmers associations to leverage economies of scale, the AKDN's microfinance programs and community insurance programs to build resilience. There's even digital finance technology, or fintech, which is gaining foothold in sub-Saharan Africa to improve access to financial services. Frigoken can help with value chain and market development, and the existing PPPs like SAGCOT are already there to develop physical infrastructure. The third dimension is representation. We should catalyze relationships between the farmers and local and regional government to ensure inclusion in decision making. And number 4 is my favorite. It's education and capacity building. International aid organizations can lend their technical expertise, but the real spark is in developing local experts as champions who can then turn and train others. I also propose a funding for selected community members to remotely attend an academic institution such as the Soil Food Web School to become soil ecology consultants and compost experts with a return of service agreement to their communities. The next 2 slides are a stakeholder map. I have bolded the stakeholders that I believe are imperative to this intervention. I envision an implementation plan that happens over the first 1.5 years, just preparatory. I want to leverage existing relationships that I have with the AKDN to discuss Quilombero, and then leverage their relationships with Frigoken, etc., and then reach out to the Quilombero Farmers Association and other aid agencies to gauge their level of interest. An introductory in-person meeting 9 months to a year out will be useful to address this agenda. The most important features of the implementation plan are that the design of the coalition is a participatory and iterative structure, and that we identify key performance indicators early on for the purpose of monitoring and evaluation. With the coalition thus designed by themselves, we can start the first trial farms and gather data a 1.5 years out. There are several anticipated challenges. The first is identifying the most effective people to engage in the coalition, and this requires familiarizing with institutional and organizational structures and cultures. It'll take time, patience, and perseverance. The second large one is overcoming the lock-in to catalyze that paradigmatic shift away from industrial agriculture. This will require several measures. The first is clear and consistent communication of the evidence and demonstration of improved yield under agroecology. Number 2 is aligning local initiatives with global and national policy, such as the climate smart agricultural policy, to avail ourselves of higher up support. Number 3 is designing ourselves out, creating self-sufficiency and internal momentum. And I think we can achieve this by capacity building and involving young people and women early on, and again, identifying the right people. Number 4, funding is always an issue. Some aid organizations come with their own funding, but we can certainly leverage organizations and governments to access international climate funding. My vision is for a coalition centered around a capable and competent community of farmers and their families who own their land and execute soil conservation agriculture. They have a self-sustaining local market economy. They're able to distribute food in an effective and equitable manner. And that arid land with poor soil fertility is transformed into thriving, biodiverse, and balanced agro-ecosystem where ambient temperatures are reduced and the rains return and no one is hungry. In conclusion, food insecurity is a complex challenge that threatens hunger for an increasing percentage of the burgeoning global population. Smallholder farmers are among the poorest and most destitute and most vulnerable to local effects of climate change, yet they're responsible for a third of the world's food production. Decades of effort to industrialize agriculture have only widened the social and economic disparity and wreaked environmental havoc, contributed to climate change. I propose a scalable cross-sectoral coalition focused on agroecology and food sovereignty for smallholder farmers to improve their food security and mitigate climate change in the local context. There is hope, evidence, and precedent for alternative nature-based approaches to agriculture such as agroecology, which is gaining recognition at all levels of governance and organization. The tides are turning. Thank you.